Hello and welcome back to the Okanagan Reader. I'm your host, Jim Bowering. Today's reading is chapters 12 and 13 of Green Comet, the first book in the Green Comet trilogy. Chapter 12 is extremely short, so again there are two this time. We're back in the past where strange lights in the sky herald the first appearance of the mysterious visitor. You might remember that I told you that the first 13 chapters were like a prologue to the story proper. Today marks the end of the beginning. On Monday, after the weekend, we'll start the story proper, as I said, with Chapter 14, where we'll find out more about the visitor and what its intentions are. So, here we go then.
Chapter 12. The Visitor. Introduction. The visitor was first seen by comet spotters. There were thousands, maybe millions of people who watched the sky every night. It was a holdover from the disaster several centuries earlier, when the planet had its close encounter with the comet. Sky watching began in earnest then and never let up since. Together with the official planetary observation system that kept a vigil on behalf of the people, the amateur astronomers mapped every moving spot of light in the system. The visitor didn't reveal itself in the normal way of comets and asteroids, by moving relative to the distant stars. It stood out because sometimes it was there and sometimes it wasn't. The spot would show up in one set of images and not in the next. It was as if the steady light of the stars and the slowly moving lights of asteroids and comets were joined by another kind that blinked on and off. The blinks came in a cluster that appeared for a span of a few weeks. Then there was a hiatus of a few years. By the time they came back, people were ready to relegate them to some unexplained anomaly. A cottage industry of speculation built up around them as astronomers tried to find a place for them in their cosmology. Nothing in their models could produce such a phenomenon. They hadn't been able to get enough data to even begin to determine their origin, so they couldn't say if the light was coming from the local system, from a distant galaxy, or anywhere in between. When the blinks were spotted again, they only appeared for a few days, then they were gone again for over a year. This time, though, they managed to extract a little bit of useful data from them. The light source was moving very slightly against the distant stars, but it wasn't moving relative to the nearer stars around it. Astronomers knew that the closest stars were formed along with their own sun, and that they were all moving in the same general direction. This would seem to indicate that the source of the blinks was in the close stellar neighborhood. That was another crucial point. It really was a source of light. They weren't seeing light that was being reflected by some object that was being produced there. And this time they had enough data to confirm that the light itself was in a very narrow band of the spectrum and that it was coherent. Finally, although this conclusion was more tentative, some observers were reporting that the intensity of the flashes was higher than it was in the first series. If this was true, then the source was either getting stronger or it was getting closer. Chapter 13. The Visitor Stops Blinking. Because comets are not permanent members of the local sky, but only come and stay for a short while before leaving again, they were sometimes historically called visitors. For that reason it was natural to call this strange newcomer a visitor. It was from away, and it seemed to be coming toward them. Even though it was obviously not like any comet they had ever seen, its actions were similar enough that the name got stuck to it. It continued to show itself in brief bursts of blinking, separated by years of nothing. As the data slowly built up, they were able to detect a weak trend. On the whole, the time between clusters of blinks seemed to be decreasing slightly, and the number of blinks per cluster, the duration of each blink, and the duration of the clusters were increasing. Astronomers, cosmologists, and physicists were at a loss. No object in their models of the universe acted this way. No alternative model of nature could produce such a phenomenon and still describe a realistic universe. Finally, they had to consider an explanation that had been growing among the non-scientific population from the beginning. It was an explanation that they reflexively rejected, but now that other, more rational ideas were plainly inadequate, they finally began to consider it. Given the coherent and monochromatic nature of the light, they had to ask whether its source might be artificial. Once they allowed themselves to think that way, the ideas started to flow. The first thing they had to admit was, if the source of the light was artificial, then there must be some agency behind it. And if there was somebody out there blinking laser light at them, then the most economical explanation had to be that it was intentional. Certainly there could be other reasons. It's possible that they were pointing the laser at something else and it just happened to also be visible here. Or they were doing something else entirely and this was just an accidental side effect. But the fact that it continued to happen for years argued against that. How could points separated by light years of space, their calculations showed that the most likely source was a yellow dwarf star 6 light years away, stay lined up like that? Much the same argument worked against accidental leakage. The obvious conclusion, though arrived at reluctantly and with much controversy, seemed to be that someone was trying to communicate with them. Some intelligent beings living just 6 light years away were using a giant laser to try to talk to them. Did they know there were people living here? Maybe they had detected some of the electromagnetic energy released by their technological civilization. Maybe they were just guessing. No matter, the objective now was to decipher the message. That was easier said than done. Years of work by scientists around the world yielded nothing. The light was monochromatic, and the color never changed more than could be explained by random fluctuations in the density of interstellar dust. Any variation in intensity was explained the same way. The polarity of the light was constant. All that remained was the blinking, and other than the weak trend already identified, there was nothing there. If there was something encoded in the blinking itself, then it would have to be a pretty simple message. There just weren't enough blinks to add up to much, no matter how you analyzed them. The frustration continued even as they gathered more data. No matter how much they accumulated, they could never make any sense of it. Then something completely unexpected happened. One day, the light blinked on and never blinked off again. This started a whole new round of speculation. Maybe the source was slewing around. Coherent light makes a pretty narrow beam, which would be very difficult to train on a target so far away. Maybe the blinks were caused by the beam striking them as it swung by, zeroing in, and now it was steady because they had finally locked on. If that was the case, then maybe now there would be a proper message. But it wasn't to be. The light remained bland and uninformative. That is, no more informative than before. There was one variable that continued to change. Just as the blinks had slowly increased before, now that it was no longer blinking, there was a weak trend in the intensity. It varied minutely, increasing and decreasing in the same random way that the blinks had appeared and disappeared. And now there was also a barely detectable increase in overall intensity, a very slight upward trend in an otherwise haphazard scatter of data points. This was going nowhere. It was more than 2 decades now, and they were no further ahead than they were when they first saw the visitor. For all they could get from it, it might as well be a firefly out over a meadow. Worse than that. At least with a firefly they had some idea what it was up to. This thing was incomprehensible. How could something so obviously artificial display so little evidence of intent? That's when they reached a consensus, almost without discussion, that they should try to communicate with it. They would build their own laser, which was easy enough since they were already using similar technology for light sail propulsion. They would match the frequency of the visitor's light as closely as possible to show that they understood at least that much. Then they would shine it out into space. Only their light would be full of information, such as sequences of prime numbers, to unambiguously let the visitor know, if there was any intelligence there at all, that there was someone here. It had absolutely no effect.